Well, welcome everyone to this month's edition of the Willow Creek Association monthly webcast. So glad that you carved out some time to be with us, and I think by the end of our time, I think you'll be glad you did. Before I introduce our fantastic speaker, or guest actually, just wanted to let you know a little bit of why we do these things. It's to help you in your leadership and management. We want to tackle a leadership issue or a management issue, invite some subject matter experts to come in and talk about that, and hopefully all of our leadership will improve as a result. And along the way, we want it to be a conversation, so there's a place at the bottom of your screen where you can kind of chat, interact with the others that are kind of tuning in. And also along the way, on the right-hand side of your screen, there's going to be some polls that pop up every once in a while. If you'll go ahead and answer those, it'll give you a sense of the perspective and point of view of the other people that are tuning in on the webcast as well. Also, in the chat space, if you have some questions, go ahead and put those in that chat space. We'll collect those. Our team will look at those, serve them up to me, and then at the end of our time, I'll be able to ask our guest some of those questions. We'll be able to interact on those. So let me introduce our guest. His name is Mark Miller. He's been a friend to me and this ministry for almost 2 decades now. He has helped us in so many ways. He's given us counsel, advice. He's been a volunteer leader in many different roles over the years. We're very grateful to him. But his job is actually working for Chick-fil-A. This is Mark Miller. And Mark, you started working for Chick-fil-A as an hourly employee in 1977, right? 35 years ago?
That's correct.
And you kind of worked your way from there to the warehouse and then up into the corporate office and communication, training and development. And now, I love your title. It's VP of Corporate Effectiveness.
Yes, sir. That's a new role. Just recently did a reorganization. We're trying to figure out how to help prepare the business for the growth that we see in the next decade. Yeah. And so we've dedicated a team of basically internal consultants to help respond and hopefully proactively prepare the way.
Yeah. Well, I know that the subject matter of leadership is very near and dear to your heart. And I know that most of you probably know Chick-fil-A as kind of the originator of the chicken sandwich and committed to customer service and excellence. What you may not know is that Chick-fil-A is passionate about leadership development. And this guy right here, Mark Miller, has probably, more than anyone I know, has helped craft, hone, define, and help implement the culture of leadership development inside of Chick-fil-A. And so that's going to be the subject matter of what we're going to talk about today. But if you wanted to also get in touch with a lot of his thoughts about leadership, want to let you know about his website. It's greatleadersserve.org. Go to that website. You'll be able to kind of keep up to speed with the latest of what he is thinking about leadership development. I think you post at least 3 blogs a week on there. Mm-hmm. So lots of great content. So let's start out, before we get into some questions about how Chick-fil-A does leadership development, let's talk about you a little bit.
Okay.
When was the first time that you started to sense that maybe I'm a leader and maybe I ought to pay attention to leadership?
Well, it actually goes way back. I think I was in the 4th grade, and I was the catcher on our baseball team. And I didn't know anything about being a catcher. I mean, I was basically drafted to be the catcher. And so I literally went to the library and I got a book by Johnny Bench on how to be a catcher. And that's my first recollection of the potential, the prospect that I might be a leader, because Johnny's point of view was the catcher is the leader on the field. Now, yeah. You might have some pitchers that would argue with you over that, but and so I began to look for opportunities to serve my team in that capacity. His point was the catcher's the only one that can see the entire field.
Right.
And the catcher can designate a cutoff man or where a throw should go and actually provide on-field leadership. And so as a 4th grader, I started trying to learn about how to better serve my team.
Wow, fantastic. So then I think others started to observe and notice that you did have some leadership gifts and abilities. And I think that was kind of why you started being noticed and started kind of moving up the ranks of Chick-fil-A.
Well, Perhaps. When I worked in the restaurant, I actually struggled. I wasn't a great team member. Did the best I could, but just don't do well with my hands. And so it was not until I got to the corporate office that you could argue someone said this young man may have leadership potential, but I don't think it was because of that. I think it was because I was just willing to work hard. And I say that because I was working a full-time job, and I was going to school taking 20 hours a quarter at night trying to finish my degree, and I was asked to work on some additional project work, and I explained to them that I was working full-time and I was going to school 4 nights a week, and they said, well, what are you doing after you finish school? And so I would come back at 11 or 11:30 at night and work on these projects because these were extracurricular projects. And so more so than being recognized for my leadership potential, I think somebody said, hey, this kid's willing to work hard.
Wow.
And I think that has opened some doors and created some opportunities, but I'm not sure how much leadership they saw in me when I was 19. But I was willing to put in the energy and the effort.
Well, nonetheless, you have been involved in really helping craft and hone and design Chick-fil-A's leadership perspective. And what did you notice along the way as the need for leadership grew inside of Chick-fil-A? You began to observe some things. Talk to us about the evolution of leadership development inside of Chick-fil-A as it has grown unbelievably. I mean, from 1977 to today.
Right.
It's unprecedented amount of growth in that period of time.
Yes, and I think one of the things I noticed was that the world was changing. I was the 16th corporate employee, and so leadership development back in the day is what we now refer to as immersion and osmosis. And at a certain scope and scale, that actually can work. But as the organization began to grow, we began to see cracks, as I refer to them. We had leadership opportunities, and we'd look to the leadership bench, and there wasn't anyone ready. And so it was about the year 2000 when we said, we need to accelerate leadership development. And I think that was a defining moment for us. I say that began the modern era of leadership development at Chick-fil-A. Not that we hadn't developed leaders prior to that, but it had been very organic, and we felt like we needed to be a little more intentional. And so that began a journey to answer the question, how can we accelerate leadership development? And that journey is one we're still on today.
Well, and Mark, just so we get a sense of scale, how many employees are there at Chick-fil-A today?
Well, corporate, we have 1,000.
Okay.
But we have 1,700 restaurants and about 70,000 employees. But those 70,000 employees are not corporate employees. They're employed by those independent operators. But all in all, we've got over 70,000 folks in the enterprise.
Annual budget revenues?
About $4 billion in sales this last year.
So pretty
That's
significant.
a lot of chicken.
Yeah, it's a lot of chicken.
Yeah.
What were some of the things that you began, when you said cracks, what was one of the most significant cracks that you began to detect as you started to look at how do we do leadership in a more intentional way with scale?
Well, the first thing we realized was that we didn't have a common language. We didn't have a common definition. When 3 or 4 leaders would be seated around a table talking about leadership, what we discovered is they had, in many instances, fundamentally different definitions. And we saw that as a huge impediment to accelerating leadership development, because if we define it differently, it raises questions about who do you recruit, and who do you select, and how do you train them, and how do you develop them, who do you recognize, who do you promote. And we really ran into it when we started trying to move leaders across the organization, and one function would say, well, I've got a leader who's ready for that opportunity, and the receiving department would say, we don't think that person has any leadership in them at all. I was like, well, whoa, wait a minute. I think they're a leader. Well, I don't think they're a leader. Well, how do you define leadership? Well, how do you define leadership? And we found out in the process that we couldn't accelerate something we couldn't define.
Yeah. In fact, I would say, Mark, from the majority of churches or organizations that I run into, very few of them actually have put a stake in the ground and said, this is in fact what we mean when we say a good leader, or what leadership means, this is what we mean.
Well, let me tell you one other reason it's so important is because each and every one of those leaders is correct in their own definition. We discovered in our research that there are over 6,000 published definitions of leadership.
Wow.
So it's not that anyone is wrong, it's just that some of those definitions lead you down a different path regarding the talents and skills that you bring to the table and how you develop those and how you deploy those.
Yeah.
And so we just felt like that was critical. One of the things I ask leaders to do from time to time is to pass out a 3x5 card and get everybody to write your definition of leadership and then be prepared,
right.
and repeat the process until everybody's answer is the same. And that may take months. It took us a couple of years to figure it out. Now, I tell people one reason we were so slow is we sell chicken. We're not leadership development experts. But we spent a couple of years trying to answer that question. What do we want leadership to look like in our organization?
Right. And so you said 2-year process trying to come up with what is Chick-fil-A's definition of leadership development. Tell us about that. What did you guys end up deciding this is what leadership looks like in our world?
Okay, I'll give you 2 parts to that answer. To start with, there's a picture. We felt like a picture would help us to talk to people about leadership.
Right.
And we actually chose the image of an iceberg. And we think it's the perfect metaphor for leadership. If you think back to 5th grade, and some have more trouble doing that than others, but think back, you probably studied icebergs. And you would know that about 10 to 15% of the iceberg is above the waterline. Well, that means 85, 90% is below the waterline. We think that's true about leadership. We think the 80 to 90% below the waterline is the character of the leader. And we think that which is above the waterline are the skills of a leader. And so this really helped us because we had been engaged in a debate, and I run into it still from time to time. There are those folks that think leadership is all about character. Well, actually, I just don't think that's right. And I think I can prove it to you. If you think about someone you know with impeccable character who couldn't lead themselves out of a room, it's not a character issue. Right. It's they don't have the skills of leadership.
Right.
Now, there are also people who believe leadership is all about skills. Well, I think that's an equally flawed position because you can probably think of someone you know who has the skills of leadership that you would choose not to follow.
Right.
And you would choose not to follow them, not because of a skill deficit, but because you have questions about their character.
Yeah.
So for us, that has been a very helpful picture as we think about leadership, that it is about character and skills. The way Drucker says it is the quality of character does not make the leader, but the absence flaws the entire process. So we're saying it's about both. Yeah. Now, I presented this idea to a group several years ago. It's one of the first times I'd ever done the iceberg. And I had somebody who jumped right in and said, that's biblical. Now, I love group participation. It can be a little disconcerting in a large group, as you can imagine. But I didn't even really want to go there. So I kind of said, well, I believe all truth is God's truth. And I kind of turned away from that section of the room. And the person shouted out, you're not listening. Well, at this point, they've got my attention and the entire audience. So I've got to actually go find this heckler and try to deal with this situation. And so I said, sir, well, I'm trying to listen. Is there something specific you'd like to share with us? He said, I'm telling you, it's in the Bible. Well, I've read most of the Bible, and I'm scrolling as fast as I can, thinking iceberg, iceberg, iceberg. I mean, where's this guy getting a verse about an iceberg? So I said, is there a particular verse you'd like to share with us? And he said, yes. He said, Psalm 78:72. And he stopped. Well, I panicked because it was clear he expected me to know what that said. And I said, sir, I need to apologize to you and to the entire audience. I don't have all the Psalms committed to memory. And I'm guessing there's somebody else here who doesn't as well. Would you tell us what that says? And he said, it's about King David. And it says, he shepherded his people with integrity of heart, and with skillful hands, he led them. And that's become our prayer, is that we can raise up a generation of leaders with integrity of heart. That sounds a lot like character. Yeah. And with skillful hands, he led them. Yeah. So our macro picture of leadership is it's about character and skills.
But now because I've looked at your definition of leadership, and we're going to go through that here in a minute. But when I looked at that definition of leadership, you just talked about character being the 85, 90%
that is
of the
correct.
deal.
Yes.
But I look at that, and I don't see character listed there. So if it's that important, then how are you dealing with the character side of this thing at Chick-fil-A if your definition doesn't include it?
It's interesting you mention that because we get that question often. And it actually caught us by surprise in the beginning. Quite candidly, our response was, oh, well, you select for that. And the feedback we got from the marketplace specifically is, not everybody selects for that.
Right.
But we're trying to select for character.
Right.
And somebody said, yeah, but can't you transform and reform and reclaim and shape character? And I say, sure, it's called parenting. And reparenting is just messy. And thankfully, they're professionals who do that. And they're pastors and ministers and psychologists and others and counselors. And they're in the character reformation business. But we're in the chicken business. And so we've said we're going to work diligently to select for character. Therefore, we'll focus our time, energy, and effort on helping men and women develop the skills. That's why our definition is a working, behaviorally based definition. We are making the assumption that we've selected folks based on character.
Now, in the selection process, you can't tell character right away. You see the tip of the iceberg, not what's below the water. So how easy is it to get hired at Chick-fil-A if you're hiring for character?
Well, I think it's challenging. We actually have borrowed your model that we're looking for character, competence, and chemistry. We just start with character. And I don't know how others discern that. We do it by talking to people. And we talk to them a lot. And people have lots of interviews over a prolonged period of time. And we are, in fact, trying to discern those questions of character.
So when you say a long period of time, what might be, like 6 months, 2 months, 2 weeks?
At least,
how long does it
6
take?
months, I would say.
6-month process.
Would be, well, some longer.
Some longer than 6 months. 4 interviews, 10 interviews?
6, 8, 10, 12, 15.
Yeah. No, I remember the
and I'm
first
not advocating
time,
that.
No,
I mean, I'm just saying we're kind of over the top on that.
But the first time I had this conversation with you and I said, well, tell me about your leadership development process. And you said, well, truthfully, like almost 3/4 of it, like 75% of it is in selection. Selecting the right people. Now, you can improve their skills, but man, the selection process is so significant, and that's affected us here at Willow Creek. I remember I was talking to Bill the other day, and he was referring to a meeting that he had with some recently newly hired people, and they were joking with each other about how many interviews they had to go through. And one guy was saying, "Oh, I topped that. I had over 20 interviews." So, I mean, that's unbelievable in terms of the amount of conversations that it takes, because there's not something you can tell right away what someone's character is like. All right, so
we'll talk more. We'll get back into that in just a minute.
Okay. Well, let's before we get into the definition of leadership here, what I'd like to encourage all of you to do is to think of a leadership challenge that you're dealing with right now. And as we go through the different steps of leadership, or the different angles of the definition, practices, there you go, of leadership, try to apply them to a particular issue that you have in mind. So I just want to challenge you to put that in your mind right now. As you think about that issue, kind of let these different leadership practices speak into that, okay?
Yeah, can I underscore that? I believe that whether or not the next 20, 25 minutes have value or not hinge primarily on whether or not the participants do this. Because I'm not excited about sharing content for content's sake. I'm excited about helping leaders take a positive step forward. And so I think if you'll articulate that challenge, it'll actually give you a backdrop with which to hear these ideas and against which to hear these ideas. I think that's a pretty important part of what we're going to do here this morning.
Very cool. And so in your 2-year research, you ended up landing on 5 behaviors, 5 practices.
That's correct.
These are the things that great leaders inside of Chick-fil-A do. So let's talk about those. What's the first one?
Okay, well, let me say this. We ended up with hundreds, probably over 1,000 things that leaders do, which was actually quite frustrating for us as a team as we worked on this. But we were able to distill that down to these critical few practices. And we believe the first one is that great leaders see the future. I mean, this is really about vision. This is when you articulate for people, what is it we're trying to achieve? What is it we're trying to become? What is it we're trying to accomplish? Why does this matter? And we think leadership always begins with a picture of the future.
Yeah. And Bill Hybels has actually talked about the precursor to seeing the future and a vision is in fact what he called in kind of the church world, holy discontent. That the precursor to seeing a better way is being so uncomfortable with the way things are today that you begin to believe and you begin to see a vision for how it could be better in the future. And then out of that comes a deep-seated conviction that there must be a better way. Now, that could be a grand vision about it's not right that the church is not doing X and needs to do X, and it's big and grand and all of that. But it could also be as simple as, Our organization stinks at leading at leading meetings. We don't know how to lead meetings, we don't know how to facilitate them. We really are bad at that. So the holy discontent, or could be as simple as that, and then out of that starts to emerge a vision. And for those that have leadership gifts and abilities, it's living in that discomfort that begins to emerge a point of view about a better and more preferred future. That's that first one, seeing the future.
Absolutely. The only thing I would add to that is often things don't have to be terrible. I mean, they can be. But a leader can see a better future even if things are good. So yes, but it's a discontent. It may be discontent because things are terrible, or it may be a discontent because there's a gap between where we are and the potential
good and great,
and the opportunities. The good to great scenario. So yeah, it could be a turnaround situation, or it could be we can just be better. We can do better. We can accomplish more of our redemptive potential, as you guys talk about.
Well, talk about how that, because Chick-fil-A is a great company. You guys could just sit on your laurels and so what's the preferred future that's emerging at Chick-fil-A? You guys are a great company, good company, growing, unprecedented, all of that. How are you guys continuing to find a preferred future?
Well, I think it's probably rooted in our corporate purpose, which is to glorify God by being a faithful steward of all that's entrusted to us and to have a positive influence on everyone who comes in contact with Chick-fil-A. So if you articulate a purpose like that, it's hard to become complacent. Now, we still have to fight it. I'm not saying it's a gimme. I mean, people get comfortable, things start working. If you're not careful, you'll move into let's play defense versus let's play offense. But with an organization grounded in that purpose, I find it easier to push forward than an organization that says we're going to, do whatever, some other financial metric or something that's important, but it's not to glorify God, faithful stewardship, positive influence. I mean, when are you finished being a good steward? When are you finished having a positive influence? So I think that helps us stay motivated.
Cool. What's the second practice?
The second practice is great leaders engage and develop others. And we actually started talking about engagement before it was cool. I mean, it's become cool recently, and we're excited and we're glad. Our definition actually has two parts. The first part you referenced earlier. This is who do you recruit? Who do you select? Who do you invite to join you on your team? And we take that very, very seriously. People often ask me if I can defend that. And I said, well, I don't know if a 96, 97% retention is a defense or not, but our corporate retention rate hovers in that range, as does the retention rate with our restaurant operators. But
that seems amazing to me.
Yes.
In the quick serve industry, to have a 97% retention at the operator level?
Yes, those are the men and women that run the restaurants. And so, again, I don't know if that's an adequate defense or not, but I think rather than defend it, I'd like to take a quick story to try and explain it. Peter Drucker, in one of his last public appearances, opened the floor to questions after his prepared remarks were completed. And it was kind of an awkward moment. I mean, I guess if you've got a chance to ask the world's leading authority on anything a question, you want to ask a thoughtful question. It was like no one was prepared. And finally, one brave young man stood up and he said, Dr. Drucker, what's the most important decision that a leader makes? Well, the awkwardness that had been present was now superseded by the new level of awkwardness. Because I guess if you're the world's leading authority on anything, you want to give a thoughtful response. And it was as if no one had ever asked Dr. Drucker that question before. So he just kind of sat there. He was so old at the time, he couldn't even stand up to make presentations. He was seated to begin with. And he kind of bowed his head and closed his eyes and began to think about this question. He sat there so long that they thought he died. I mean, they were really, somebody was about to go poke him. It was like, should we call 911? Well, somebody needs to go check on him. I mean, he sat there that long, and then finally he began to straighten up, and you could kind of feel it in the room. It's like, he's going to speak. He said this, who does what? Now, I've thought about that a lot. You think about the most important decision a leader makes. So our explanation for why we're so diligent on selection is we believe Dr. Drucker.
Yeah.
We don't think there's a more important decision. I mean, think about all the times that you've had to deal with issues because you missed that one.
Who does what?
And so that's, again, not even a justification, but I think it's an explanation for why we spend so much time, energy, and effort on selection. Yeah. And I think that is that is fundamentally why we've been successful, because we've developed the ability over time, working together, to do that well. We think it's far too important for a single person. I mean, that's a team effort that we make those decisions. And then quickly, the second half of engagement is when you and I as leaders create the right context and environment so that people can willingly invest themselves fully. This is, you think about somebody their first day at work, how excited they are. Yeah. Well, we ask the question, how excited are they 6 months and 6 years later? And if they're not, we look at the leaders and go, what have you done to create an engaging environment? And we spend a lot of time and energy on that. We think the best leaders do.
Wow. Now, a huge skill that's a part of that, you guys have identified as listening. So unpack why listening is such a key part in this.
Well, I think, one, it aids in discernment when you're trying to make the first part of that engagement decision. You're trying to decide who do you need to invite to join you. You've got to listen to what is said, and you've got to listen to what is not said. Yeah. You got to ask great questions. And so listening is one of those core skills that helps you engage the right people to begin with. Then when you move into this other phase or facet of engagement, which actually is more challenging, I believe, and more time consuming, is creating the right context. There are some generic things that every human being needs in a work context, things like clear expectations and boundaries and encouragement and resources, and those things lift engagement. But the reason listening is so important is that people value those things differently. Recognition as an example. Different people value different forms and types of recognition. So I think you've got to listen to discern those things so that you can create not just the most engaging workforce generically, but that you can create the most engaging context for individuals. And if you don't listen, you'll miss all that.
Wow. So see the future, engage, develop others. What's the third one?
The third practice is reinvent continuously. Okay. And unfortunately, that sounds like a buzzword from the 80s, but we think it captures pretty well the essence of what we're talking about. When we describe this to our leaders, we've given them 3 hooks, and this is not exhaustive, but 3 hooks to think about this. The first arena of reinvention is self. What are you doing to continue learning and growing? It's kind of the speed of the leader, speed of the team. So you've got to be reinventing yourself. Second, you've got to be reinventing the systems and work processes. We tell our folks hope is not a strategy. I mean, hope is a wonderful thing, but you don't hope for more sales or hope for better cost control or hope for better retention or hope for better quality. It's like, no, the systems and processes that you have in place are creating a certain output or outcome. We learned this from our engineering friends. And unless you're willing to change input or process, you're not going to change output. So we're telling leaders that you've got to be willing to reinvent the systems and work processes. And third and finally, you've got to be willing to reinvent the structure as needed. Structure should enable, not inhibit. So if it's really hard to get the work done or things are falling through the crack, it doesn't mean you've got a structure problem, but it's one of the places you need to take a look, because that's what structure's supposed to do. It's make things easier. So that's what reinvention means to us at a kind of a high level.
Now that other word was continually, reinvent continually.
Yes.
Can you do too much of that?
Well, I think judgment is always part of the equation. I think leaders have to be discerning. One of the things we've learned from the TQM world is that focus is very important. And so can you do too much of it? I have seen many instances where leaders tried to reinvent too much at one time, and you dilute your energy and your effort, and you just don't get the traction that you need. I have yet to see an organization that is focused in their reinvention efforts that does it too much. Because once they solve one problem, they move on to another and to another and to another. And I think there's always a problem, even if the problem is how do we keep getting better. So there's an ever-present problem. So,
and I remember even in Jim Collins' research, when he looked at the organizations that were truly great organizations that differentiated themselves, it in fact in many of these industries wasn't the most innovative. It was the organization that innovated enough. That innovated at the right level for their industry. And I mean, zero's not the right answer, but changing everything all the time, there's nothing solid that people can stand on and count on, preserve the core part of it. That doesn't work either.
That's back to judgment. That's back to judgment. Sure.
Okay, next one. Fourth one.
The fourth one, value results and relationships. And this is the one that is most difficult for me as a leader. It's most difficult for us as an organization. And based on the leaders I've interacted with around the world, I think this is the most difficult for most leaders. Now, I've got some unscientific research based on my conversations with leaders around the world. About 95% of the leaders struggle with this. About 5% don't, and I don't like them because God made this easy for them. But here's the essence of it. Most of us as leaders have a natural bias. We are either more results-oriented or we are more relationship-oriented. What we've discovered is the best leaders value both, but the majority don't do that naturally. They have to compensate. Yeah. And we challenge our leaders, we're not trying to change you. We're going to give God the benefit of the doubt. We're going to assume He knew what He was doing when He made us and when He wired us. But we still observe the best leaders value both. So does that mean 95% of the leaders can't reach their full leadership potential? We think not. We think what it means is you learn to compensate. I often use the example of reading glasses. So I don't think that makes a leader a lesser leader. I think that makes a leader a wise leader because he or she has said, I'm going to do this to compensate for something I don't do naturally well. So we just tell our leaders, you've got to own your bias and you've got to find ways to compensate.
How about you personally? Which side do you lean more on?
I'm more results oriented.
Okay. How have you compensated?
I'm always compensating, always looking for ways to compensate. Give you just a couple of examples. One is I think you need to bring, one option for leaders to consider is to bring people around you who have a different orientation. If you're results oriented, you bring some relationship oriented leaders around you. Another random example from my life is I set a goal a few years ago to write 250 notes of thanks and appreciation and encouragement. So I actually took this relationship activity, made it a goal, put it in my plan, and tracked it so I could, in my brain, twist it into a result so that I could do that. Now, the relationship-oriented people in the audience are kind of freaking out. But all the results-oriented leaders are going, that's a pretty good idea.
Write that one down.
So you just got to figure out how you need to compensate and what you need to do. I got one idea from Bill years ago, and I may have taken it a little out of context. So I want to give him credit, but also give that bit of grace. He was talking about how to be more relational. He wasn't talking about it in this context. And he said he asked himself the question from time to time, what would a great relationally oriented leader do? He said ideas always come to mind, and sometimes he does those things. So I asked that question from time to time. What would a great relationship-oriented leader do? I can almost always come up with ideas. And from time to time, I will act on those things. So that's another way that I'm compensating.
It actually affected where you had your office positioned. Talk about that.
Yes, we were building out some new space for a number of reasons I won't go into. The architect had said that a particular space needed to be my office, and it was actually a very, very lovely office, about 40 feet of glass. You know, it was beautiful. It was on the corner, overlooking the creek. It was spectacular. But I told him I didn't think I could do that because it was very close to the steps in the elevator. And my fear is that I would have come down the steps or off the elevator and gone straight to my office. And I said, my staff is on this floor, scattered out as far as you can see. I said, I'd rather have my office on the other end of this floor. So when I come down the elevator or down the steps, I would at least have to move through the people to get to my office, because that would be an ever-present reminder that my staff is there and they have hopes and dreams and needs and concerns, and it would give me at least an opportunity several times a day to connect with them, if not deeply, at least to acknowledge their presence. And glad you're back from maternity leave, and how's your son who's sick? I think I would have missed all that because of my bias. I would have been in a hurry. I would have missed that because of the physical location. So that was one way that I chose to compensate.
Well, I love the way that you guys proactively talk about relationships and results, because it makes it like it gives permission for leaders to talk to other leaders about it. Because some of the most challenging is when you as a leader have leaders under you that, let's say, are awesome at results and they beat people up. And so this makes it like legal. Hey, we're going to talk about this. You're a results person. Wonderful. You're killing your people. terrible. That continues, you're not going to be able to be here.
But yeah, it's
over
not
the
only
long haul.
legal. What we say, it's a new and broader definition of success. If you just get results, you can
That's
still
not
fail as a
success.
leader.
That's not
and if you
success.
just have relationships and don't get results,
Right.
you can fail as a leader.
Right.
Jim Collins talks about the genius of the and from his first research study, those organizations that found a way to embrace two things that are, at least on the surface, they're in opposition. He talks about the power you unleash if you can embrace both. We think valuing results and relationships is a perfect example of the genius of the and.
And I love the compensation idea too, because
Yeah, just have
there's
to
hope.
compensate. Oh,
and
yeah.
then, because we're one or the other.
Most leaders are.
95% of
Most
us.
leaders
and
are.
so let's compensate around that and let other people hold us accountable. But eventually it will be a problem.
And I think it's a journey. I don't
don't
think you
compensate.
finish. I don't think you stop.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
think you keep wearing the glasses because they help.
Yeah. Final one.
Okay.
Last one.
The last practice is great leaders embody the values. This is about walking the talk. This is about building trust and credibility. This is about the fact that people always watch the leader, whether we want them to or not. Well, what are they learning? What's being reinforced? Are you in fact, am I in fact, living in accord with the values that we say are important? You can torpedo all of the other practices because it goes back to trust.
Sure.
It then goes back to a character issue, and people don't follow leaders they don't trust.
Right.
We think it's critical.
Yeah. Wow. How in the world do you get 50,000 or 70,000 people, however many number at Chick-fil-A, 1,000 people at corporate, to remember a 5-part definition of leadership for Chick-fil-A? If you're wanting everyone to have a good idea and run with it.
Yeah, it's funny you asked that. It started with our original charter. When we're doing this work, our charter was to find the answer, our definition of leadership, and it needed to have only 3 parts. That was part of our charter. Like we couldn't do that. We just couldn't do that. We tried, and we even combined some things. You can look at it very carefully and go, they probably got more than 5 things in here. And then Ken Blanchard and I did a book around this same topic, and the publisher came back and said, can you reduce this to 3? So nobody wants to remember 5 things. But it is what it is. Now, we did find a hook that we thought was pretty helpful, and it helped ground the idea in our culture. And it's an idea from Jesus. We think he actually had it right in Matthew chapter 20, verse 26, when he was talking to his disciples about leadership. They wanted positions of leadership. And he said, you don't even understand leadership. He said, those of you who want to be great leaders have got to be willing to become servants. So we've tried to anchor this in the psyche of our organization by creating the acrostic, great leaders serve.
Yeah.
S is for see the future. E, engage and develop others. R is reinvent continuously. V, value results in relationships. And then E, embody the values. Yeah. We wish it were 3 things. We really wanted it to be 3 things. We tried to make it 3 things. And I even explained to the publisher, they had the manuscript and they said, can you make this 3 things? I said, well, the secret is great leaders serve. There are 5 practices, and they spell serve, and they said, yeah, we got that. Can you make it 3? I went, no, we can't make it 3.
It's 5 letters in serve.
There are 5 letters in serve. So that's how we've tried to help the organization get it. But more than that, we're trying to teach people, we're trying to model it, we're trying to build performance around it, performance evaluations around it. I mean, we're trying to make it part of the culture, and it's a journey, and we've been on that journey. We're still on that journey. I'm meeting Friday with a bunch of new supervisors. We'll do a half-day session with them, and I'll spend a couple of hours unpacking the S.E.R.V.E. model for new supervisors.
Yeah.
So it's becoming part of our DNA, but it's been a slow journey.
Yeah. Now, I just challenge you. Remember the challenge that you wrote down. And as you looked right through the S.E.R.V.E. model, was it a vision issue of seeing the future? Was it an engaging and developing people issue? Was it a reinvention issue or a valuing of results or relationship? Was it an issue around that, or was it an issue of embodying what you're trying to do? My hunch is almost every issue a leader is dealing with could find some solution and remedy in one of those 5. At least that's been
we
y'all's
often
practice.
believe that next step is rooted somewhere
in that.
in that.
Yeah. Now, I know that beyond being a business person, for all these years at Chick-fil-A, again, because of our friendship along, all that time, I know you're a churchman as well. I mean, you're very involved, have always been deeply involved in church life, in church work, teaching and training and being with church leaders. So, you can speak into the church. And you have the authority to do that and the grounding and experience. When you look at leaders in the church, of the 5, which is the one that you think you tend to see church leaders challenged the most or having the toughest time living out?
Well, it's actually the same one that we see leaders struggle with in the marketplace, and it's valuing results and relationships. Now, in the marketplace, I think you would say there's a greater number of leaders who have a results bias, and so they struggle on the relationship side. But in the ministry, I see it just the opposite. I see so many leaders who are relationally oriented, they have trouble on the results side. But it's still that tension. It's that genius of the and. Yeah. It's elusive, both in the marketplace and in the ministry. And so that's what I often have to encourage and challenge church leaders, ministry leaders with. Yes, we need to be relationship minded, but you've also got to run a successful ministry if you want to continue to be viable. Truett, Kathy, our founder, often says it like this, is there's no mission without margin. We've got to be a successful business or we can't do the good things that we want to do. Well, a ministry has to be successful or it can't do the good things that it wants and feels called to do. So I think the valuing results in relationships is, for most leaders, the most challenging of the 5. Now, there's ample challenge in the others, but that one is the one that I tend to see bubble up.
Well, I mean, I'd resonate that in my own leadership, and I get to play on the church side and the association side as well, and could resonate with that, no question. So Mark, you got it defined, wonderful. Common definition, everybody's clear on that, but how do you actually live it out in an organization with the scale of yours? How do you actually build a culture that embodies those 5 practices? Well,
we are still on that journey, but I will tell you it was a rude awakening because naively we believed we were done. We were finished. I mean, we knew we had some communication stuff, but after we worked on this and we said, okay, we've now got our point of view on leadership, it's like, whew, okay, what's our next challenge? Well, what we realized, we didn't really just need a point of view on leadership, but what we needed was a leadership culture. And we define that as a place where leaders are routinely and systematically produced and you have a surplus. When you've actually got more leaders than you need. And so as I have done quite a bit of work in the church world, I don't know many churches that would say, yes, we've created a leadership culture by that definition. Many churches on that journey, but routinely and systematically produced, and you have a surplus. And so once we redefined the problem, we said we still think the work we've done is valid. We think the first step in that process is you've got to define it. You've got to say, what's our leadership point of view? Whether it's one of the 6,000 existing definitions out there or whether you're going to create your own. But secondly, we figured you got to teach it. Because for somebody to have an understanding of your point of view is a good thing, but that doesn't mean that they have the personal capability to execute on that definition.
Right.
So we actually had to begin training people and teaching our point of view. Third, we realized that most of what you and I know about leadership, we're actually going to learn it through practice. And so that's the third step, is you've got to give, particularly emerging leaders, you've got to give them opportunities to practice. I think there's a normal and natural bias. If you or I had a leadership challenge and we look to our bench, we're going to probably give it to the strongest leader available. I use the baseball analogy. You're going to put in a pinch hitter. You've got a 200 hitter on the bench and a 300 hitter. You might put your 300 hitter up there. Well, what we found is we were always putting our seasoned leaders on the new challenges, and that was stealing an opportunity from the emerging leaders, and that's where most leaders are going to learn to lead. So we're trying to discipline ourselves. Sometimes we'll still give it to the seasoned leader, but more and more we're having the discipline and the courage to say, we're going to give this leadership challenge to an emerging leader because we think practice it is very important.
But because I've unpacked this a little bit with you, but you don't just let them out there all by themselves. I mean, you guys will give an emerging leader a real task, the authority to run with it, but you don't leave them alone either.
Well, we try not to. I don't want to say we're flawless on that, but no, we want to give somebody an appropriate challenge, an appropriate next step. You don't want to give somebody down here you think has leadership potential this huge challenge, but you give them what you feel is an appropriate challenge, and you do it with them, or you help them, or you coach them. And yeah, we don't want to, it's not a sink or swim mentality, at least in our context, but we think practice is critical. Next is we think to create this leadership culture, you have to measure it. And we're learning, and we're trying different things. It's taking different forms over time. It's now part of our organization. We're beginning leadership talent reviews, where we're actually evaluating every leader against the S.E.R.V.E. model. There are metrics around how many people have been trained. I mean, so we think that when you say measure it, there's probably not a metric, but it's probably a family of metrics that will help you discern the progress that you're making on creating this culture. And then fifth and finally, we think existing leaders have to model it. We just think that's critical. If an organization chooses to embrace and pursue this idea of servant leadership, you need to have men and women who are at least striving to be servant leaders. If you're not modeling it, then the whole thing kind of blows up. So those are the things we're doing now that we have a leadership point of view to try and embed it in the culture. And it's a journey. Been on it for 12 years and still miles to go before we rest.
Well, it's been cool to watch you guys. And again, you've been a model to us, and we've tried to learn from that. Let's take some questions now from folks that have been tuning in. Here's one. How does Chick-fil-A do strategic planning? What's your process for doing strategic planning?
That's probably another web event. That's a big one. let me say, again, for us, that's a process. You got to understand, I've said this before, people think I'm kidding, but we're a restaurant company, you know, and we are learning these things. And as we are growing, you may have commented, someone commented earlier that not only have we grown, we've grown quickly. It took over 30 years to get to the first $1 billion in sales, and we've added $3 billion in the last decade. So we're at $4 billion, and the curve looks promising. Years. Yeah, but so we're learning these things, and our systems and our processes are trying to catch up. The short answer to that is we try to figure out what are the organizational priorities. We cascade those throughout the organization, asking the various departments and functions to create their plans with those in sight. And at the end of the day, budgets are assigned to departments to execute those plans, and then every department gets to bring forward ideas that they would like to do above and beyond their budget allocation, and we have a team of very gifted men and women who look at those and they allocate the money that's available. It's almost a venture capital model beyond the individual department plans, which that's all, you know, that's a kind of a pro forma. You know how much money you got and you give it to this department, that department, and they're trying to help execute the larger corporate goals. But then we want to create this marketplace for ideas, because every department's going to have some list of things they think would add value that are outside the money they've been allocated. And so those ideas come to this group that tries to make good decisions about what are we going to fund over the next 24 months. So that's a very simple answer. It's a pretty complicated process.
Might have you back for that one.
Whatever. There's somebody better than me on our team who could come do that for you.
Well, let me ask you a little bit about something that I think there's some interesting crossover between your world and church world. In the church world, and I would encourage all leaders in the church to not just view your leadership development paradigm with your staff, but it in fact is the whole congregation. You're trying to equip the whole congregation. I love hearing stories of where leaders were intentional about leadership development, starting from when someone comes to Christ, and they grow them up, then they become volunteers, and then volunteer leaders, and then leader of volunteer leaders, and then part-time staff, then staff. I mean, it's a pretty cool process that I've seen some churches do. In fact, one megachurch in El Salvador, some 70,000 folks go there. They put their people, like when they come to Christ, the very next week, they're in a leadership development track. Right away, they want to start finding out where are the leaders, and then they begin to build off of that. But what's interesting about the way you guys are organized, different quick serve companies are organized differently, but the way you guys are organized is you have 1,000 in your corporate headquarters, then you have all these stores that sell chicken. They're independent.
That is correct.
They're not technically under your control.
They're not
you can't
employees.
Tell them
that is correct.
to do anything, right?
Well, we have operating and brand standards.
Okay.
We have a contractual
There's
agreement.
An agreement. You got to follow that.
2 pickles or 3 if they're small on a Chick-fil-A sandwich.
Right.
We don't discuss and debate that.
Can't violate brand.
That's part of the brand, right? But on management and leadership practices, that is their domain.
Right. And in the church, it's hard to kind of tell volunteers certain things. Like you don't have lots of leverage over them. You don't have all leverage over your stores as well. How do you help your stores emulate these practices that you believe in so strongly when you don't have that control lever?
Right.
You can't put that into the contract.
Right.
How do you do that?
Well, again, I'm sorry I have to keep coming back to this. It's a work in progress. These are things that we don't do and say they're done. They're things we work on.
Yeah.
But to your question specifically, we believe people change for one of 3 reasons: vision, pain, or fear of future consequences. We've tried to play the vision card. Now, some of our leaders will adopt new management and leadership practices because they see pain. Or I say see pain, they feel pain.
Right.
Or they may embrace new management and leadership practices because there's another restaurant being built several miles away.
It's doing better.
And they see, well, no, they would love to operate that restaurant, but they have a fear of future consequences that if they continue their current management and leadership practices, they may not be given the opportunity. We have about 12 to 15% of our restaurant operators have 2 locations. And it's driven in part by proximity, but it's driven in part by their capacity, our assessment of their capacity to actually operate 2 restaurants. Yeah. But knowing that sometimes it's vision, sometimes it's pain, they're under the stress and the burden of leadership, and sometimes it's fear of future consequences. The way we try to get folks to embrace a future is primarily through vision. As we cast vision, we try to cast vision forever, always, about a preferred future. And we share success stories, and it's the grander vision, and imagine with me, what if? And so we do that in lots of ways. One that you're familiar with is we have an annual meeting when they all come together. That meeting is a lot of things, but I would say at the end of the day, it's a lot about vision casting. That's our primary mechanism for change, particularly in the management and leadership arena.
Yeah, no, it's a cool event. Been to it. Here's another question. Get real practical. How do you, in fact, deal with someone who's delivering amazing results and they're beating up people? How do you deal with that, leader?
Well, it's just unacceptable. We have a broader definition of success, and we will address those issues. Thankfully, we don't have a lot of those. Now, in part because of selection. Right. In part of, we have such a strong culture. People understand early the norms, and if they don't, I remember I selected someone, this was years ago, I was in our field operations group, and I selected someone, and they had been with us not 30, maybe 45 days. I mean, we're talking a brand new person. And I had probably the most harsh conversation I've had with anybody in my 35-year career. And I said, listen, you have not gotten off to a great start. Here are issues. They are going to, you're going to train wreck yourself here in record time. If you don't, you just have to have those conversations. Yeah. This is that person's life. And that may have been perfect behavior where they were before, but as leaders, we have the responsibility. We feel the responsibility to help men and women who join our team to be successful. Do everything we can to help them be successful. And so in that particular example, we just, now, P.S., that person doesn't work with us anymore.
Well, I was just going to ask you,
anymore.
Which side, in your experience, has been more redeemable? Those that are focused on relationship but a little weak on results, or those that are heavy on results and weak on relationship? Between the two, is it about equal in terms of we've seen turnaround, or do you see more turnaround in one than the other?
Well, I speak to the challenge of valuing results and relationships. For us as an organization, our challenge has always been on the results side because we are so relational. We are so relational as individuals and as a company. Have a lot more. I have over the years had a lot more conversations with people about what do we do to bolster and show up results. I've had very few conversations where I've had to deal with people on relationships. And unfortunately, it does happen from time to time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it could be different for different organizations.
Oh, I
there
think
could
it
be
would
other
be.
organizations that are heavy on results,
Yes.
and that's 80% of their people. But I think the point is being aware and being intentional about here's where we are. We have to work on this because we're weak.
Well, and not
and
yes.
compensate.
Well, it is
as an
awareness,
organization.
but it's also, and this is the irony of it, is you will produce better results over the long haul if you value both. I mean, that's kind of, it's almost counterintuitive. You mean if I spend less time thinking about results, I'll get better results? Yes, that's the genius of the and. When you put those two together, you actually get more of what many leaders want anyway, because leaders love results. Leaders love progress. But by investing time and energy on the relationship side, you actually will see more fruit, which is kind of crazy.
Well, thanks so much, Mark. As we close here, I just want to give you one last shot to leaders that might be tuning in that are leading organizations. Any final words to them, encouragement, challenge, whatever, around leadership development?
Well, I think it starts with me and you as individual leaders. One of the big ideas that we've been exploring for many, many years is that your capacity to grow determines your capacity to lead. And so once you and I as leaders embrace that, we're in a much better position to serve others and serve our organization. Next time you're on an airplane, pay attention to what they're saying when they talk about the oxygen mask. They say, put yours on first. As leaders, we've got to put our own mask on first. If we're not learning and growing, we're of diminished service to others in our organization. So I think that's my first word is don't neglect yourself. And then I guess I would say make the choice every day to be a servant leader. I mean, that's one thing that excites me about these 5 practices is each and every one of them is fundamentally a choice. If you look at them individually, am I going to pursue a preferred future? Am I going to engage and develop others? Am I going to reinvent continuously, starting with myself, and so forth and so on? And so my encouragement to leaders is to make the choice. You know, at the end of the day, choose to serve.
Yeah. Well, Mark, thank you for choosing to serve us for so many years.
It's been my pleasure.
I really appreciate the friendship we've enjoyed over the years and the help that you've been to me, the help you've been to us, and now the help you've been to a lot of leaders. Thank you for giving of yourself, even through your website. Again, I want to highlight that. If you want to get a little more of Mark's thoughts on an ongoing basis, you know, bookmark this webpage, greatleadersserve.org. Pick up its book as well on The Secret that he co-authored with Ken Blanchard. Fantastic book. And then second, for those of you that have been to the Global Leadership Summit, wanted to let you know before we sign off here that we're going to extend the in-conference pricing that we had. It's the best pricing we'll have for the Global Leadership Summit throughout the year. That best pricing will end October 30th. So go ahead and reserve your spots right now at the best pricing for next year. Remember, if you want to come on site here to Willow, it's sold out 5 months ahead of time. So if you want to reserve a spot here on site, you got to do that soon and early, and now's the best time to do that. Or reserve a spot in your satellite location and lock in those best rates. So I wanted to let you know that October 30th that ends. And then also want to encourage you for next month's webcast. This is going to be a fantastic webcast like this one. It's Thursday, November 15th at 11:30 Central Time. Charles Lee, he's the CEO of the Ideation Consultancy and founder of the Ideation Conference. And he's also the author of Great Idea, Now What? Here's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about how do you take a great idea that you came up with or someone on your staff, great idea, how do you implement it? That's where 90% of great ideas find their death. They don't get implemented or they don't get implemented well. So he spent a lot of time thinking about that. So we're going to get to pick his brain and have a conversation with Charles about that on how do you implement great ideas successfully. So be sure to put that into your calendar. And again, Mark, thanks so much for being with us today. Thanks you guys for tuning in. Have a great day.